afternoon. Merci d'être venu aujourd'hui en cette journée un peu froide. My name is Daniel Bellin, and I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important for us at MISC to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. We encourage everyone here today to seek out more spaces for learning and understanding the history of these territories. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, which is known as MISC, M-I-S-C, is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as today's lecture. And as you can see, if you look at our program online, we have events on a wide range of topics that are important for Canadians. If you want to know more about these events and about MISC, you can visit our website at mcgill.ca/MISC. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Julian Sher, an award-winning journalist and the author of 7 books, including Until You Are Dead, The Wrongful Conviction of Stephen Truscott and White Hoods, Canada's KKK, Canada Ku Klux Klan. He co-authored 2 books on biker gangs as well, The Road to Hell and Angels of Death, which have been widely read, and also he wrote 2 books on crimes against children, One Child at a Time and Somebody's Daughter. As an investigative reporter, he worked for the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail, and was a senior producer for CBC's The Fifth Estate. He is active in protecting media freedoms as a senior fellow at the Toronto Metropolitan University's Center for Free Expression, and also working with journalists for human rights. So here, of course, Julian today will speak about his most recent book, The North Star, Canada and the Civil War Plots Against Lincoln. We are very interested here on Canada-US relations and also on Canadian history at MISC. So this is a way to bring these 2 topics together. What's interesting about this book, of course, that it weaves together the different strands of several Canadians and a handful of the Confederate agents in Canada as they all made their separate fateful journeys into history. So this is a book that you have copies here, and the book will be available for sale after the talk. So Julian, it's all yours.
Merci. Merci, Daniel. Merci. It's a real honor to be back in the Leacock building. I don't know how many of you were here, but 50 years ago, when I had different colored hair, I spent many an afternoon or a morning in these halls. Je vais parler en anglais parce que le livre était publié en anglais, mais évidemment, je peux prendre les questions, puis on peut avoir une discussion après en français aussi. I'd like to thank Danielle and the McGill Institute. For those of you who were originally signed up for this talk a few weeks ago, I got struck by a rather severe case of the flu. My voice is still a little hoarse, but I should be able to power through. I was a history student here at McGill in the 1970s. Back then, you know, we had to get to school by riding our horses uphill both ways in the snow. And we came to the Leacock with, you know, pens and notebooks. For the young ones in the back who don't know what pens and notebooks are, just look it up in Wikipedia. I'm sure there are pictures. But the 70s were quite a stormy time to be at McGill, especially if you looked like a young Che Guevara. It was the Vietnam War, the coup against Chile, and of course the October crisis. And if you were a young, long-haired student walking home at 4 a.m. in the morning because you were working overnight at the McGill Daily, and you'd have to pass these gun-toting soldiers, it was quite an experience. Now, as a student, I took a walk out the Rada Gates, just a few blocks down, to the Bay, Union and St. Catherine. And I noticed a plaque. And the plaque was to Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Confederate South. And I remember thinking at the time, why is there a plaque for the leader of the slave South in my city? And why, at that time it was about 100 years after the Civil War, why is it still there? Well, it took about 50 years and 7 books for me to finally find the answer to that question. And I'll try to take you through some of my investigations. Now, I grew up studying history here, and I think most of you, when we think of the American Civil War in Canada, the only thing we really know, most of us, is the Underground Railroad, right? 30,000 escaped slaves would make it to Canada just by putting their feet on the ground. They became free. Martin Luther King famously, when he was speaking in Canada in 1967, called Canada the North Star. And he talked about how it was linked with the history of my people. Sadly, of course, he made that speech 1 year before he would be assassinated. So that's the myth that we grew up. It's true, and it's something we should be proud of. But as I and a handful of other historians have found out, it really is only a small part of the truth. So let's go back to Montreal in the 1860s. This is what it looked like. That's the view from the Basilica. You can see the mountain, and in the background you could see McGill. This was the political geography of our country. Canada didn't exist as Canada. It was going to become Canada in 1867, but when the war broke out, we were British North American provinces. Canada West, largely what became Ontario. Canada East, Quebec. And the United States was also divided. The North, under Lincoln, and the South was the Confederacy. Now, when the war breaks out in 1861, Lincoln and most people in the North hoped, assumed, expected that Britain would side with the North because it was a democratically elected government that was dealing with an illegal secessionist slave South. But much to their horror, Canada, like the rest of the British Empire, declared its neutrality. Now think about that, right? You know, what the British Empire was saying is, between Lincoln and the slave South, we're neutral, right? That's like, you know, between Putin's invasion of Ukraine and Ukraine, we're neutral. We're not going to pick sides. Now that had direct consequences because it meant that Canada during the Civil War would become a safe haven and a staging ground for the Confederates. They didn't do this illegally. They didn't do this secretly. They didn't do this in hiding. This was open, as you'll see. It was in newspapers. They went to the finest hotels. They met with the leaders of the aristocracy. So this wasn't some hidden plot. It was in the open because Canada, in effect, was neutral, which meant aiding and abetting the South. Now, early 1864, the war's been going on for 3 years. And for the first time, the tide is turning against the slave South. They're not losing yet, but they're stopping to win. We know how the war was going to end, but if you were there in 1861, 62, 63, you didn't know. It looked pretty bad for Lincoln and the North. So Davis convenes a special meeting of the Confederate Parliament. And he will authorize $1 million, which is about $12 million today, for secret services in foreign countries. And that'll be directed by his Secretary of State, Judah Benjamin. Now, most of that money will go to Canada. Davis will pick Jacob Thompson, a Washington veteran who knew Lincoln and was a good friend of his, to go to Canada to run the Confederate Secret Services. He will make his way fighting the blockade, sneaking into Halifax, then take a train to Montreal. And in Montreal, he will start his banking. This is a sample of his bank book, where over the years, he would have something like 649,000 US dollars in his Montreal bank account, essentially a slush fund. The bank was the Ontario Bank of Montreal. It's right near the Basilica. It's now a modern bank building, but it was right near the Notre Dame Basilica, and it was run by this man, Henry Starnes, who was a former mayor of Montreal, a member of Parliament, and one of the most prominent aristocrats. Now, after the Lincoln assassination, when the bank employees were questioned, they openly said they knew these were Confederates, they knew them well, they were on a first-name basis, and when they were asked about the money laundering and the financing, they said, well, we never ask a man about that, a man doing business with us, deposit what he likes, and we never ask any questions. We do not know what he's going to do with this. All this came out in the investigations after about the Lincoln assassination. Now, what did the Confederates do with all that money in Canada? Well, these 4 men were sent to Canada. They were kind of like Navy SEALs or Green Berets for the Southern Confederacy, elite soldiers who had joined a group called Morgan's Raiders. And they were in Canada openly, not secretly, and they would carry out things like the New York arson attack. November 1864, they sneak into New York. They check into 19 different hotels under assumed names. They're carrying these little suitcases. They, in each room where they check in, they put what was called Greek fire, very similar to Molotov cocktails, and they set them alight with bedding and clothing, hoping to burn down Broadway and most of New York. Now, as it happens, because they closed the doors and the windows, the fires never got out of the actual rooms, but it caused huge panic. You can imagine the next day in the New York Times and the New York Herald, there was panic in the street, fire engines everywhere. Miraculously, nobody died, but right away, the American newspapers knew that the plot had originated in Canada. This man, Dr. Luke Blackburn, stayed in Montreal. He was a Kentucky man, one of the world's leading experts in yellow fever. He treated yellow fever all through the States and then went to Bermuda during one of its worst outbreaks in 1864. But nurses and staff noticed that as he was treating patients, and nobody knew where yellow fever came from or how to cure it, he would take the soiled linen and their clothing, and he would store it in trunks, and he sent 6 trunks to Halifax, where he was based, and then hired somebody to sneak the trunks into several northern cities, including trying to send a package to the White House for Lincoln. In effect, an early form of bioterrorism. And he would say later that he hoped to kill thousands of Northerners. And again, when this became public, it caused a huge scandal in the American papers, and it was clear that Canada had not only sent people to try to burn New York, they were now trying to engage in bioterrorism. Perhaps the most successful raid was led by a young, handsome man named Bennett Young, out of Montreal. He and about 20 of his men go to St. Albans. Any of you go skiing in Vermont, it's pretty much the first town you hit. And from his point of view, it was only about 20 miles by horseback across the border. In a matter of minutes, they raid 3 banks, steal something like $250,000 in local currency at the time, kill an innocent bystander, try to set fire to the town, and then gallop across the border. Now, they're all arrested quickly, and the Americans, of course, expect that these terrorists, which is what we would call them today, would be tried and quickly extradited. Well, what happens, if you go down to the Jacques Cartier Bridge, this prison is still there, au pied du courant. It looks exactly like that. I stood there. They were treated in jail. Louis Payette ran the jail, and they called it Payette's Hotel. They had white linen, tablecloths, and fine wine. And the papers reported how the elite of Montreal and Montreal's finest ladies would come to visit these heroes. In fact, Bennett Young has an affair with the daughter of the judge who's leading his trial. And they'll be defended by none other than the dean of the law school of this university, John Abbott. This man, Bernard Devlin, the city councilor who, by the way, would be responsible for what we now know as Beaver Lake and the mountain, the park on the mountain, represented the Americans and the Canadian government, and he talked about how great good or great evil will mark the result of this decision. What will happen will determine how Canada is viewed. Now, he would lose the case. And what we found out later is the Confederates had high-powered friends. The judge throws out the case on a technicality, saying he doesn't have jurisdiction. He will later be investigated and reprimanded for judicial misconduct. The Montreal police chief at the time, Guillaume Lamotte, meets with the Confederate agents and the judge and a Confederate banker. He'll arrange on the eve of the trial decision to literally take a carpet bag and have it stowed, the money that they did capture, about $90,000, stored in which bank? Henry Starnes Ontario Bank. And the minute the men are acquitted, they dash out in a sleigh that's waiting for them outside the courthouse, dash to the bank, pick up the stolen money, in effect stealing it a second time, and escape. Several of them, including Bennett Young, will get rearrested, and in another trial, he'll again get acquitted. So by this time, the Americans are apoplectic. Lincoln denounces this in what would become his last State of the Union address, and several American papers call for the invasion of Canada because they realize that Canada is basically a backwater for Confederate terrorism. Now, the elites, as we've seen, supported the South. Political leaders, church leaders, business leaders. We've seen Henry Starnes. Our first prime minister in the 1864 Charlottetown Conference, Confederation Conference, spoke about the gallant defense that is being made by the Southern Republic. At this moment, they have not much more than 4 million of men, yet what a brave fight they have made. This is our future prime minister 3 years into the war, when it's obvious by now this is a war about slavery. John Abbott, the lawyer for the St. Albans Raiders, would become Canada's third prime minister. Most newspapers were anti-Lincoln. La Minerve, run by another father of Confederation, Georges-Étienne Cartier, had no shame praising the Confederacy for having the most intelligent armies we have known in America. The Niagara Review denounced Lincoln as the mad, blood-stained despot in Washington. Again, we imagine today that Lincoln was seen in the way most of us see him today. That was not the case. In fact, if you were living in Montreal and reading the Gazette, this is what you'd be reading in the Gazette, one of the most staunchly pro-South newspapers. It talked about how all white men are necessarily slave owners and interested in the preservation of their lives and property. It warned that blacks would massacre their masters. And remember the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, now seen, of course, as an historic turning point. If you read about the news of the Emancipation Proclamation in your copy of the Gazette that morning, you would have read these words: "The proclamation will be little more than an indecent exposure of Lincoln's rage and fiendishness." That's how the Montreal Gazette saw the freeing of the slaves. The church, English and French Catholic Church, opposed Lincoln. Archbishop Thomas Connolly, who led the powerful church in Nova Scotia, meets with the Confederates and sends a letter to the church across the country, saying that the cause of the South commands the respect and sympathy of the world, and urges his people to support the Confederate cause. We'll talk about the French Catholic Church in Quebec in a few minutes. Now, while the elites generally, not all, but while the elites generally tended to support the South, many ordinary Canadians tended to back the Union for different reasons. This young man went to McGill, was a Montrealer. He was born in the Eastern Townships. He joined the Union Army, as did about 30 to 50,000 English and French Canadians. In fact, some regiments had 5 to 10% Francophones. That's how many Quebecers signed up. Many Canadians died, 29 earned medals of honors, and 5 of them became Union generals. 2 pioneering black doctors. Dr. Alexander Augusta was an American black who couldn't get into any American medical school, comes to Canada as a free man, and graduates from the University of Toronto as Canada's first black doctor. And he will mentor Dr. Anderson Abbott, a native-born Canadian, born of free American blacks who had immigrated, and Anderson Abbott will become Canada's first native-born black doctor. The minute Lincoln opens up the Union Army to blacks, which was a little-known clause in the Emancipation Proclamation, in January 1863, these men immediately write to Lincoln, and both will be accepted in the Union Army and will serve as surgeons. As did several thousand Canadian blacks, including many who would die. Those of you who remember the movie Glory, would die in a famous battle as members of a black regiment. This is the letter that Alexander Augusta writes to Lincoln. Now, when he goes down to Washington, he gets accepted. Lincoln's government says, great, we'd love to have you as a black man serving in the army. He shows up in Washington for the interview, and the officials come out and see this black man, and they assume he's the manservant giving the letter of introduction. And then when he walks in and they realize he's actually the doctor, they refuse to accept him, as the New York Times reports, and the Lincoln government has to overrule the Army board, saying, no, you will accept him as a black surgeon, and he will become the highest ranking black officer. He'll also be mobbed by a bunch of racists in Baltimore when he's wearing his uniform, and will be saved by a handful of soldiers. Anderson Abbott will become a leading civil rights leader as a surgeon, and I love his words where he talks about the Civil War as not a war for white men or black men or red men or yellow men. It was a war for humanity. Now, the doctors are working in horrible conditions. The black soldiers are dying at a much higher rate. They have horrible equipment, horrible medical care, but still they're devoted. And one night in early January 1864, they decide to crash a party at the White House. I love their chutzpah, basically. 2 black doctors, elegantly dressed in their uniform. Lincoln has regular levees at the White House. They walk in, and according to Abbott, there's kind of like a hush, right? It's the North, but it's still not modern times. But they go over to Lincoln, and Lincoln shakes their hand, and according to Abbott, Robert Lincoln's son is aghast, saying, what are you doing? And they leave, monocles are dropping, mouths are agape. Later, when Lincoln will be assassinated, Mary Lincoln will give Anderson Abbott, the Canadian doctor, one of his shawls as a memento of thanks. This woman, Emma Edmonds, was one of the most famous women in the Union Army, but of course nobody knew she was a woman. She was a New Brunswick farm girl, chafed at the restrictions of women at the time. So she leaves her farm as soon as she can, disguises herself as a man, and becomes quite a successful Bible salesman, and makes her way to Flint, Michigan, still always dressed as a man. And when the war breaks out, and this is what the book is about in many ways. It's the choices we make, just like the choices we make today about what's going on in the Ukraine or the Middle East or Afghanistan. What side are you on? And Emma writes, "It is true, I was not an American. I was not obliged to remain here during this terrible strife. I could return to my native land. But the great question to be decided was, what can I do? What part am I to act in this great drama?" So she signs up. Back then, basically if you had a pulse, you were in the army. There wasn't much of a medical check. She signs up and for 2 years operates as a Union Army soldier. She's a mail carrier, a nurse, and when she will finally tell her story in a best-selling book, it becomes a huge success. There's a lot of exaggeration, as I point out in the book, but most of it is true. And then 30, 40 years later, she doesn't have a pension. She leaves the army, so her name was Franklin Thompson. She's listed as a deserter. She contacts the men who never knew she was a woman. One of them was actually in Congress at the time. Another was an editor. And because of their campaign, Congress passes a bill that names her as Emma, says she was Franklin Thompson, that she was not a deserter, and gives her her pension. So those are the kind of Canadians who went south. So in many ways, the American Civil War divided our country as much as it divided the United States. Now, the war is dragging on now into 1864. The South is losing badly, and Canada and Montreal will become even more so hotbeds of Canadian conspiracies. Who will show up in Montreal in the fall of 1864? John Wilkes Booth. Now, John Wilkes Booth was kind of the Brad Pitt of the 1860s. Handsome, one of the most famous actors. According to one biography, he's the first actor to have his clothes ripped off by adoring fans. He comes in October of 1864 to Montreal. And where will he stay? Like almost all Confederates, he stays at the St. Lawrence Hall. Now, the St. Lawrence Hall, you could still, if you go by St. Jacques Street, kind of near where the old Gazette building was, just a bit west of the Basilica, you'll see the building. It really hasn't changed much. Now, back in the day, it was one of the most illustrious hotels in North America. You know, it boasted a dining saloon, a concert room, a reading room, hot and cold baths, exquisite restaurant, and also conveniently for the Confederates, telegraph station. The American newspapers were delivered constantly. This is a shot of the dining room. And the owner, Henry Hogan, openly admits that his hotel was the headquarters, he called it, of the Confederate junta. All the Confederate leaders, Luke Blackburn, all the agents would hang out, as would the Union spies. In fact, Henry Hogan, who ran the hotel, had a peephole in his office so he could kind of look at the action. He sees John Wilkes Booth. He's a huge fan of John Wilkes Booth. This is his registration. He gives him room 150, according to Hogan, one of the better rooms in the hotel. And Booth is seen playing cards with leading Confederate agents. He'll meet with one conspirator who's known to be an open advocate of assassination. He will also get names of 2 Confederate members of the network in Maryland and Virginia. And after Booth assassinates Lincoln, he will use those contacts he got in Montreal to try to escape. Now, he also wants to do banking. So just as he stays in the St. Lawrence Hotel, where does he do banking? At Henry Starnes Ontario Bank. He walks in and he gets the equivalent of what we used to call traveler's checks, a bank draft, worth about $300. And he openly says, I'm going to use this, I'm going to be running the blockade, like, will I be okay? This comes out in the testimony. And the chief teller says, absolutely, only you could cash this, this is only in your name. right? So again, it shows how the Confederates weren't spying, they weren't lurking, they were hobnobbing with the aristocrats and getting the finest service from our banking institution. Now, I like to say, if the St. Lawrence Hotel was, if Montreal was the Casablanca of the Civil War, Dooley's Bar was Rick's Cafe. It was an elaborate bar, and it was a famous pool room. And before John Wilkes Booth leaves Montreal, he decides to play pool with a Monsieur Dion, Joseph Dion, who is the Quebec pool champion. The two men are playing pool, and as Booth consumes more and more alcohol, he starts making these statements that Dion will later report. At the time, they don't mean much. He says, now this is just a few weeks before Lincoln's campaign in November. People thought Lincoln would likely lose. He manages to win. Of course, it'll be the last election for him. So Booth utters these words: "It made damn little difference, head or tail. Abe's contract was nearly up. Whether re-elected or not, he would get his goose cooked." Those are the words that Lincoln's assassin utters in Montreal just months before, in fact, he will kill President Lincoln. April 14th, he will, of course, sneak into the president's gallery at Ford's Theater. Lincoln is assassinated. Now again, if you're in Montreal walking to McGill or having your coffee on Sherbrooke Street and you open up the Gazette newspaper, what are you going to read about the assassination of Lincoln? This is what the Gazette wrote. It talked about the great loss which the South sustains in his death. The paper reminded that it had always questioned the justifiableness of the war itself. And it feared, again, Lincoln has just been assassinated. And the Montreal Gazette says, whoa, the calamity which his assassination causes the southern states is great. That's how the Gazette reports Lincoln's assassination. The London Examiner says it must be remembered, as atrocious as Booth's deed was, it was literally justified by the facts. The man he killed had murdered the Constitution of the United States. The Toronto Leader, the leading pro-Southern paper in Toronto, said that there is some cause for the assassination, blaming Lincoln for the oppressed people of the South. That's how most Canadian papers treated Lincoln's assassination. Now, remember our Quebecer, Edward Doherty? He's sitting in Lafayette Park on Monday after the assassination, taking a break. A messenger comes to him and says, you have to report to the War Department. And he discovers he has been tasked with leading a 25-man army regiment to track down the assassins, John Wilkes Booth and an accomplice named David Harold. I write about this in a cover issue of Canada's History. Now, Booth takes off in a horse with Harold, will go through Maryland, enter Virginia, using the contacts he got in Montreal. Doherty and his men will eventually track him down to Garrett's farm in Virginia. The two men are holed up in a barn. Doherty convinces Harold to come out. Booth stays in. They set fire to the barn. A shot rings out. They first think that Booth has maybe killed himself, but in fact one of Doherty's men kills him. He says, as Booth was lifting up his gun, he thinks to kill Doherty or one of the other soldiers. And as Booth lays dying, what do they find? What do Doherty and the others find on his clothing? That bank draft that he had gotten from Montreal. So you have a Montrealer who hunts down Booth, and in the killer's pockets, we have a Montreal bank draft. That's how closely tied we were to the American Civil War. Now, a few weeks after the assassination, the Washington government is determined to blame not just Booth, but the whole Confederate leadership. There is no evidence that the Confederate leaders knew or ordered the assassination, but I talk at length in the book about how they helped Booth in other ways, and they created the circumstances with which Booth carried out his assassination. So ultimately, they were responsible. But at the time, Washington issues arrest warrants for what they call 6 traitors. And as you can see in the headline, most of these traitors are harbored in Canada. 5 of the 6 men named by Washington as co-conspirators are in Montreal or Toronto. Now, they eventually hang 4 of the conspirators, including Mary Surratt, the first woman to be executed by the American government. Her boarding house was a nest of spies. John Wilkes Booth stays there. And the authorities know that Booth is very close to her son, John Surratt. The evening of the assassination, after all, it was, John Wilkes Booth, the Brad Pitt of America, jumps onto the stage. Everybody knows who he is. Everybody knows he just killed Lincoln. There was no mystery. That evening, within hours, the authorities dash to Mary Surratt's boarding house, knock on the door, and they say, "Where is your son?" And she quite honestly says, "Montreal." Totally normal, because that's where he's been often as a courier for the Southern Confederacy. And in fact, the day after the assassination, the Globe reports Booth and Surratt, the assassinations, they are supposed to be escaping to Canada. Well, in fact, Booth was headed south, but Surratt was in Montreal. Now, where does he stay? You'll never guess. The St. Lawrence Hall. And he writes about how he admires the beautiful church, the basilica, and of course the beautiful women. Now, he can't stay long in the St. Lawrence Hall because everybody kind of knows it's a Confederate hangout. So he turns to the Catholic Church. The leading agent in the Confederacy contacts 2 leading priests, and they will scurry away with John Surratt, and he will hide out in Saint-Liboire, which is just on the other side in the South Shore. They'll hide him there for months. Then he goes briefly to La Malbaie. Then he comes back to Montreal, where he stays at the house of another church leader. And then, because they realize things are really getting hot by the end of the summer, the Catholic church leaders write a letter to the Vatican and get Surratt into the Pope's private army, the Zouaves. He will eventually be found in Italy a year later and brought back to trial, and he will be acquitted. It's now May 1867. Canada's about to be born. Civil War has been over for 2 years. And Jefferson Davis is the defeated president, has been in jail from 1865 to 1867. He gets bail. And where does he go the night he gets bail? Doesn't go to Memphis, doesn't go to Mississippi, doesn't go to Mobile, Alabama. Where do you think he goes? Montreal. Takes a train to New York and then heads straight to Montreal. He's originally planning to stay, of course, in the St. Lawrence Hall. But friends collect money. He stays at a few private homes, and at one point, he will stay at the home of John Lovell. Remember Lovell's Directories? Lovell was one of the leading publishers in Quebec and in Canada. He constantly published pro-Confederate propaganda, and Lovell's house is where the bay is now located. That's where the plaque came from. That's why the plaque actually says the leader, Jefferson Davis, stayed at the house of John Lovell. But of course, that's only part of the story. So think about this. The defeated president of the Southern Slave Confederacy comes to Montreal because he knows it's a safe refuge and has always been a bastion of Confederate support. He shows up at the Théâtre Royal. Doesn't exist anymore, but it's on a street very close to our convention center. And he shows up at a Southern benefit, and when people recognize him, the play stops, the band breaks out into Dixie, The crowd gives him 3 cheers and cries out how the South will rise again. This is a picture Davis takes with his wife in Montreal, and these are his words as he's leaving Canada. May peace and prosperity be forever the blessing of Canada, for she has been the asylum for many of my friends, as she is now an asylum to myself. So there you have it, the words of the slave leader, quite accurately saying, Canada, you were our best friend during the Civil War. I want to end with an important point about the lost cause. Now, usually the victors get to write history. That's just the way it goes. But the Civil War is the only war I know where the Confederates got to write history. And the history of the Civil War continues to be whitewashed and glorified. Remember Luke Blackburn, the leader of the Yellow Fever plot? He returns to his native Kentucky after the war and gets elected governor. And when he's running, some of the northern papers say, wasn't that the guy behind the Yellow Fever plot? And in a style that's echoed today, Blackburn's supporters dismiss it as fake news. They say, maybe he was never actually in Canada. Bennett Young, the leader of the St. Albans raid, he'll actually come back to Montreal for a reunion at an illustrious downtown hotel, the Ritz. He'll meet with his supporters, and then he'll go to Arlington Cemetery with the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, and they will unveil a huge statue to the Confederate soldiers, which explicitly talks about the lost cause. The Arlington Cemetery, where black soldiers like Alexander Augusta were in a small segregated section of the cemetery, only was desegregated recently. And of course there was Birth of the Nation and Gone with the Wind. The Gazette, it's now 1959, okay? Like, guys, wake up, right? This is like a century after the Civil War. Davis's mother-in-law is buried in the Montreal cemetery, but kind of in a hidden grave. So a Confederate supporter decides to honor her and put a Confederate flag over it and write the tombstone. And the Gazette not only puts it in its front page, but in an editorial says that it's an act of gracious remembrance for a family sorely tried by the misfortunes of history. 1959. Statues start coming down around 2017 across the states as Canada is trying to grapple, as the U.S. was trying to grapple with the lost cause. Now remember that plaque in Montreal? It was put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The United Daughters of the Confederacy was born in the 1890s with the explicit mission of rewriting history. They would go through textbooks and say, we can't have textbooks that talk about the South as evil or slavery. We have to talk about slavery as good. We can't disparage our roots. Does that sound familiar in terms of what's going on today in Florida and elsewhere, the attempt to rewrite history? The United Daughters of Confederacy were the ones who put up the plaque in 1957 in Montreal. Recently, their building was attacked during riots after the George Floyd murder. Now, the plaque comes down because I'm working at CBC Toronto at the time, and I call my daughter, who's working at CBC Montreal, as statues are coming down, and I say, you should maybe check to see if that plaque to the Confederacy is still there. Sure enough, CBC calls up, as do other journalists, and that day, the Bay takes down the plaque. New plaques are going up. In Toronto, there are going to be 2 new plaques to the 2 black doctors. So in many ways, I think we're finally coming back to where we should have been. The past is never dead. It's not even past. Those words were spoken by a young black senator running for president, Barack Obama. And as Lincoln said, history is not history unless it is the truth. Now, ironically, in April 2023, the front page of the Gazette has the story that maybe they should have run in 1863. I'm a bit biased because I wrote the story. But they finally got it right. They talked about the plot against Lincoln, how Montreal was a city of Southern spies. So slowly we are, I hope, retrieving our history from some of the lies and the myths. You can find out a lot more on my website. There's lots of articles, videos, stuff for you to download. And let's get some questions.